Welcome to the gathering of Westside family churches. We're not just one church, but a family of churches distributed around the world, from Leavenworth and Lansing to Laos, from Shawnee to South Africa. We're a movement of God's people gathered to love Jesus, become like Jesus, and share Jesus. And you might not think about this very often, but actually most of this Westside family gathers outside of this North Sanctuary in Lenexa. Every week we capture the teaching here, and then it goes out streaming all over the world, and it starts 2 minutes later in the South Sanctuary, or it might unfold 8 hours later in a house church that's meeting in Texas or France or Pakistan. We're this global movement connected together, living on mission for Jesus. And today, we're actually going to be doing a little experiment. We're going to switch things up a little bit. Here in the North Sanctuary at Lenexa, we're going to watch together and experience this distributed church connection through video that most of the Westside Family Church experiences on a weekly basis. We're doing a little experiment over in the South Sanctuary, trying a new environment. I'll just let that pique your curiosity. Maybe you want to come and attend a second service this weekend there if you're in the Lenexa area. But I want to ask you to enjoy and open up to this experience that's normative for much of the Westside family movement. And I want to start with this question. It's this: if you could ask for anything in life, what would that one thing be? It's kind of like that desert island question. Like, if there was one food that you could have on a desert island, what would it be? For me, it is the pizza. Anyone else? Right? Or if you could have one album, what would the album be? You know, anything by Barry Manilow or Air Supply. That's a joke, okay? What would your one album be? Let's just scale back, though, and raise the stakes a little bit higher. If God himself were to look at you and say, I'll grant you one thing, what would it be? And it might be, I'd want a different job. No brainer. Different job. Or I want all my debt wiped out, or all this complicated mess in my relationships. If that could just be solved, we'd have a lot of different answers in this room. And an answer that's actually really fascinating and surprising came from this man Solomon that we spent a lot of time with over the last few months. And his answer to this one question was this: wisdom. Now, that's not an answer that I would probably give or you would probably give, if we're honest. It doesn't feel very practical. But it was an answer that moved the heart of God extraordinarily. And interestingly enough, if you were here, you'll recall that when Solomon asked for wisdom, with that answer, he ended up actually getting all the other answers too. In fact, God says, because you asked for wisdom, now you're going to have access to these other things that we probably would have listed, like influence and affluence. It's like wisdom opened up the door to all the other things that Solomon might have needed to look for. In other words, you can write this down. Wisdom is the master key to flourishing in every area of life. Wisdom is this key that unlocks a door to flourishing in every single arena of life. Now, in this space here in Lenexa, there's 122 rooms. And I'm lucky enough, I've scored a master key, so I can get into every room. And I've been making copies, and if you want one after service, just come up and I'll give one to you, and that way you can get into every nook and cranny. If I did that, Jeff Manford would have my head on a platter, right? Because there's protocol. You don't just give out a master key to anyone. True story, my best friend, Jack, a couple years ago, started a new job as a pastor, an executive role, big church that had grown really quickly, big, fast, and their systems and administration hadn't kept up, so they brought him in to help sort of set that kind of culture. The first week in, one of the things he discovered is for years, they'd been giving the master key to anyone who asked. There were literally hundreds of copies of the master key floating around in this community. So he did a security audit the first week. He discovered Tuesday night at 11 p.m., there's a young man who comes in with all of his friends. They open up the cafe and they start making fancy coffee drinks. They were there at 1 in the morning. By the way, he's no longer a member of the church. He's still got a master key. He discovered on Thursday nights there's a lady who comes in after hours and makes hundreds and hundreds of photocopies. She no longer attends the church either because they have the master key. He said it's unbelievable. Because if you have the master key, you have access. Now here's the thing that's crazy. God is saying, I will give you the master key. You need to get into that room called parenting, and it feels locked to you right now. I'll give you the key. Wisdom is the key that opens up the door to flourishing in parenting. Business, it feels like that door's locked to you right now, that you're stuck. Wisdom is the master key that opens that door to flourishing. Your finances, relationships, one area after another. The Bible makes this audacious claim that wisdom is the master key. And over the next 4 weeks, we're going to go for the master key. We're going to spend the next 4 weeks in the wisdom literature of the Bible. And it says this about wisdom in Proverbs 8:11. Wisdom is more precious than rubies. Nothing else you could ever want is as valuable. And I did a little research this week. What is the value of rubies? The highest quality ruby is worth 10 times what a diamond is worth. Currently, gold is worth $45 a gram. A gram of rubies, $50,000. It's worth exponentially more. And the Bible is saying that is the value of wisdom. It's worth exponentially more than you would actually imagine. And this last month, we've been walking through the Psalms together. And in the Psalms, we've talked about how we need to learn to love God with our heart and our soul. That especially these more potentially toxic emotions like fear and anxiety, anger, depression, that we need to take that dark part of our heart and turn it towards God's light. We need to invite God into the basement of our heart and to bring that up and out before Him and to pour that out. And it's been an extraordinary month for us. The number of steps that people are taking to step out of the darkness into isolation, into community, it's been amazing. And we're going to continue that journey now by spending the next 4 weeks in the wisdom literature. And in the wisdom literature, now we're going to learn how to love God with our mind and our strength. In other words, there is this important component of emotional health that we've been looking at. But now we're also going to look at how do we add to that this component of reordering our thoughts, that's our mind, and aligning those with ultimate reality, which we learn through the scripture. And then also, we have this thing called the will. Loving God with our strength. Your body is like this little kingdom that you're in charge of, and you have this power source called your will. It's the ability to decide, to choose, to engage. And how do we order our thoughts and our will and our emotions so we have this rightly ordered life where we flourish? So here's the series' big idea. God keeps writing His story in us as we engage Him with our mind and our strength. And it says it this way in Proverbs 4:7. Wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. I love the eloquence of the King James English. With all thy getting. In other words, whatever getting you got, get it up and get it going. To go get wisdom. With all thy getting, get wisdom. And here's the big idea for today. It's this. Chase wisdom. Chase wisdom. With all thy getting, go and get it. And this week, when I was thinking about this idea of chase wisdom, I couldn't help but think of one of my dogs, Maury. Maury's the little terrier beagle mix. You can see she's keeping an eye out the back window in the backyard, constantly monitoring for squirrels. And this week, we had a squirrel who kept eating the bird food and climbing up, in the box. And so one morning I was just tired of it. I opened up the door and said, Maury! And Maury shot out. I was just thinking she just scared the squirrel. It didn't end up that way. Her whole world went, squirrel! And of course, about 2 seconds later, I call her the brown bullet. She's like, she's got the squirrel. And I couldn't help, as twisted as this might seem, But think of this call to wisdom. Like when Maury sees that squirrel, everything else fades away, and there is one agenda, and with all thy getting, get squirrel. And that's where we need to go. To let everything else fade, and the Bible says, with all thy getting, get wisdom, because the stakes are so high. So today we're going to look at two questions. And we're going to look in particular here at the book of Proverbs. Over the next few weeks, we'll look at Proverbs, and we're going to look at Ecclesiastes, and we're going to look at the Song of Solomon. But today is an overview of Proverbs with two questions. Number one, what is wisdom? And number two is this: how do we learn wisdom? So question number one, what is wisdom? And to answer that question, we'll look at Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. It says this: the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight, for acquiring a disciplined and prudent life, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning. Let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and the riddles of the wise. Verse 7 is really the theme of the whole book of Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. So let's just say a word about what discipline is, because this is core. Wisdom is primary, and wisdom is this: it's primarily the ability to make right, God-honoring, life-producing decisions. It's very practical. In the ancient world, wisdom wasn't primarily about information or intellectual assent to a body of knowledge per se. Now, we live in the information age. We have more access to more information than any generation in history by an exponential factor, without a doubt. But wisdom is different than information. Wisdom is the ability to take that information and to apply it to life-giving, right, God-honoring decisions that cause human flourishing. Wisdom is looking at things from God's perspective and then making decisions based off of that perspective. And there's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom. It is very possible to be extremely intelligent and stupid at the same time. Man, does anyone know someone who may have a doctorate's degree, incredibly intelligent, but they've made a total wreck of their finances? Or know someone who, you could ask them information about their particular area of expertise, and they are world class, but they've trained one relationship after another, after another, after another. It's very possible to be incredibly intelligent and incredibly stupid at the same time, because there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And interestingly enough, in the scripture, through the book of Proverbs, wisdom is personified as a woman, and a very interesting woman. It's a woman who actually exceeds the stereotypical roles of a woman in a patriarchal society. She's described in some very normative ways, like a beautifully adorned bride who crowns those who come to her, or a chef who creates a feast that has just one course after another that is so satisfying. But then there's these other images they break the gender roles of the time, that she's actually a woman who stands in the middle of the marketplace, and in our language would say, you know what, Lancioni, he's pretty smart. Collins, bright guy. But you really want to learn? Come to me. She's a woman who is a teacher, a leader, a mentor, an equipper. And interestingly enough, in the wisdom school of Israel, there was a particular call to young men to come and sit at the feet of this woman called Wisdom and to learn from her. She's also described later on as a builder, which would have been a masculine role in that society, the builder of a 7-pillared house. And she says, listen, I will teach you how to make good decisions. And the stakes are extraordinarily high. And there's this contrast and this comparison between this woman, wisdom, who will teach us how to make decisions that cause flourishing, and then what you could call folly. And here's what folly is. Folly is moral depravity, it is spiritual blindness, and social irresponsibility. So Proverbs is this very urgently important book with this contrast between wisdom and folly. These aren't just like pithy life affirmations. These aren't just, hey, here's some chicken soup for the soul. No, the stakes are literally life and death. She says to us, you listen to folly, it's going to destroy your soul. You listen to the voice of folly, it's going to destroy your marriage, it'll destroy your children, it'll destroy your reputation and your character, it'll destroy your business and your career. This is deadly serious stuff. This book was written to save people from folly that would lead to death. And there's a really profound theological reason, and it's this: we're stupid. And I don't say that to smack you down, and it's not the entire story about us, but there's something stupid inside of all of us, if we're honest. How many of you have been in a situation where you've lost your temper over and over and over again with your kids, and then they do something else to tick you off, and it makes perfect sense that you would actually lose your temper again because it's definitely going to get better results this time, but you lose your temper anyway? Been there? You ever been in this situation where you're looking at your life and it's incredibly complicated, it's overcommitted, it's frantic with activity, and then you get asked to do something else and you say yes anyway? That's called stupid. It's incredible that we can be very intelligent people who make incredibly stupid decisions. And those decisions have extraordinary consequences attached to them. And here's what's fascinating about us. In Proverbs 19, verse 3, it says this: a man's own folly ruins his life, yet his heart rages against the Lord. It's funny, we make a series of decisions based off of folly, and then at the end of it, we're like, God, why did you let this happen to me? We literally will rage at him at the decisions we made based off of the fool's voice that is inside all of us. And it says this in Proverbs 22:15. This is a sobering verse. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, and the rod of discipline will remove it far from him. Now, there's some very far-reaching implications of this verse. This is a verse that says you're not born tabula rasa, you're not born as a blank slate. You know, it's not like we're just kind of flipping coins when we decide, heads were foolish, tails were wise. No, this is the sobering thing. Our default mode is stupid. There's kind of this bent brokenness inside of us, and we're all born with this bentness towards foolishness. And we're all born with a case of the follies, you could say. And I was actually on a walk earlier this week, and I had one of those memories that sort of just popped up out of nowhere from my childhood. And I was playing with my best friend Mark Unger in the field behind our house. And we were playing superheroes and supervillains. And once again, I talked Mark into being a supervillain so I could be a superhero. That day, I decided to be Captain America. And he had some big stick that was his sword, and I had taken the metal garbage can lid, and that was my shield. And, we were battling it out, and he took off running. And I used to watch the Captain American cartoon when I was a kid, and the theme song went like, when Captain America throws his mighty shield, those who choose to oppose the shield must yield. And I was thinking about what Cap would do. And he would wing that shield, right? And it's got that boomerang effect. It hits the villain, and it comes back. And I literally yelled, "You must yield!" And I wrung that garbage can lid as hard as I could. And it was amazing. It went out into this perfect kind of radial arc, and it came soaring back in. And Mark made this little turn, and it just wham! Connected with the back of his head, knocked him clean off of his feet, face planted into the ground. Now, this kid was my best friend. So, of course, my response was, nailed it! Yes! And then I watched, and he wasn't moving. I thought, uh-oh, killed him. So I run over there, and he had a crew cut. I remember this, and he had this goose egg that was growing out of the back of his head, and it was cut, it was bleeding, and I was like, oh, Mark, don't move, man, don't move. Just take it easy, man. You need to rest. He's like crying. I'm like, take some deep breaths, all right? You really shouldn't move. You shouldn't move. And really, our parents don't need to know about this. You know what I mean? So why don't we just sit here and just rest for a while? Do you want to be the superhero? And by the way, our parents don't really need to know about this. And it struck me. I was thinking about looking Mark Unger up on Facebook. And then I started realizing, Mark Unger might respond by saying, you know what? It's really great to hear from that self-centered jerk who was always sort of giving me the short end of the stick. And as I look back on that relationship, as I was going for this walk, I realized, that what a great example of like sociopathic behavior. Here's a kid who may have a concussion, and he's bleeding, but I'm more concerned about what? Me. And avoiding the consequences for me. There's foolishness that's bound up in the heart of a child. And it's easy to laugh that off and go, well, you were 10 years old. But I was willing to look at my friend and go, well, in the pursuit of my heroic endeavors, if you get hurt, well, too bad, you got to play by my rules. And if there's consequences for you, and if I can avoid it for me, then it's fine. And what's interesting is I look back on a season in my life 4 years ago, and it wasn't Mark Unger who was on the ground injured. It was my wife and my kids, because again, I was pursuing heroic endeavors. I was going to save the world. And my family got the leftovers, and they had to play by my rules, and I was going to keep going. And at the core, it was the same voice of folly in me. When I was 10, when I was 40. And what I'm saying is the stakes are extraordinarily high. And the Bible says, chase wisdom. And I want to ask you to commit. Chase wisdom. It's the master key. It's more valuable than rubies. Let's chase wisdom together. For the benefit of our souls and our families and our community. We need a movement of people, because we're kind of like, right now, it feels like we're living in crazy town with crazy people, doesn't it? We need a movement of people who say, I'm going to chase wisdom. So how do we learn wisdom? And here's where it gets incredibly tactical. We're going to talk about 5 ways to learn wisdom, because wisdom is a choice. Being old doesn't mean you're wise. Experience isn't necessarily a great teacher. It's evaluated experience through the lens of wisdom that is a great teacher. And you know what? Being young doesn't mean you can't be wise either. You can learn wisdom at any age, but you have to decide to learn wisdom. We're going to look at 5 ways to learn wisdom. I learned this from a guy who's been a voice of wisdom in my life for 30 years named Rick Warren. And we're going to look at 5 very practical ways to learn wisdom. And here's the first one. The L is this. Listen to God's wisdom every day. Listen to God's wisdom every day. Proverbs 2, verse 6. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth, circle those 2 words. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. Now, the heart of the Israelite wisdom asserts that no one can begin to understand God's ways and life's mysteries apart from God's revelation. All solo human attempts at wisdom will ultimately fail. Wisdom is a hidden mystery that is revealed to the person who seeks God. There's a very mysterious, revelatory nature to this. The ultimate source of wisdom is not Google. The ultimate source of wisdom is not Facebook. The ultimate source of wisdom is God himself. It comes from his mouth. And the early Christians described the person and work of Jesus using language that was associated with wisdom. Look at this verse. It says, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. In other words, if you're going to learn God's wisdom every day, you need to go straight to the source. And God's revealing his wisdom through the scriptures and through his Spirit. You know, Proverbs has 31 chapters. There's 31 days in a month. One of the wisest men I know, a guy named Dan Sutherland, you know, for over 2 decades, he made a habit of reading one proverb a day. So let's say it's July 10th, you read Proverbs 10, and for 20 years it was his habit to read one proverb a day, every day, sitting at the feet of wisdom himself, because wisdom has a name, and it's Jesus, learning from God himself, wisdom. You could do that. And for some of us, this is a habit that we need to refresh in our lives, to make a time every day to literally sit at the feet of Jesus. You could start by reading the proverb associated with the day and saying, Jesus, speak to me. Give me wisdom. Show me by your Spirit how this applies to my life. And some of you, it might be a brand new habit. You're realizing today, I need to chase wisdom. I have access literally to the thoughts of God, and it's time to start a new habit. That's the first one. We have to listen to God's wisdom every day. Number 2, we need to enlist friends to chase wisdom with us. In other words, no one learns wisdom all by themselves. If you want to be wise, you have to enlist friends who are also chasing wisdom. And I love this passage in Proverbs 13. Walk with the wise, and you become wise. But a companion of fools suffers harm. A literal translation of this in the Hebrew is he who walks with the wise stacks up wisdom. Remember that old phrase, raise the roof. If you want to raise the roof in your life, you need some friends that help you stack up wisdom. And then a companion of fools, a literal translation of that is that person unravels. It's like a ball of yarn that unravels. Or maybe you've been fishing and you were casting and it didn't go quite right and it just turns into a bird's nest and it's all entangled and you're like, am I ever going to be able to get this straight again? You spend time with the wrong people. That's exactly what happens. Life gets entangled and complicated. And you absolutely need, Jesus said, wherever 2 or more are gathered in my name. In other words, you need at least 2 friends who have made the same declaration. I am going to chase wisdom. I'm going to sit at the feet of Jesus. I am going to learn wisdom. And if you don't have that, I want to challenge you. Why not start that this month? 2 friends and say, we're going to read one proverb a day. And when we sit down, we're going to remember we're in the presence of Jesus. And we're going to learn together wisdom. And then we'll get together once a week and talk about it. Because we need to enlist friends that help us chase wisdom. Thirdly, we need to ask questions and accept correction. If you're going to learn wisdom, you have to learn to ask wise questions. It says this in Proverbs 25, counsel in the heart of a man is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. Everyone has something to teach you if you will draw it out of them with wise questions. Everybody is brilliant about something, just on different topics. In other words, I can learn something and you can learn something from the person sitting next to you if we learn to ask the right questions and if we're open to correction, if we truly learn to listen. Proverbs 18:15 says this, intelligent people are always ready to learn. Their ears are open for knowledge, always looking for a new idea, always listening. And that's the key skill here. Learning to ask good questions from people that you respect. If you see someone you respect their parenting, you need to go ask open-ended questions and then listen. Truly listen. And accept correction. Not be thinking about, okay, how can I add commentary to what they're about to say so it looks like I'm intelligent and I know what I'm doing, or how do I get the final word in this conversation? No, just stop and say, I'm going to ask good questions, I'm going to listen, I'm going to accept correction. That's the third one. The next one is this. Remember and reinforce the wisdom you learn. You can't just learn it, you have to remember it. It's funny, I was in a group early this morning, my Leaders Made group. And one of the guys who wasn't there last week asked, hey, so what was the conversation about last week? How did it go? And there was this really long, awkward pause. And I remember I was sitting there going, man, I just can't remember it all. I have no idea what we talked about last Thursday. And finally, someone was honest enough to say, I don't remember. And then I thought, there's one guy in our group, Curtis. Every Thursday when we have our conversation, he's got his journal open, he's taking notes, and I said, Curtis, what did we talk about last week? And he opened up his notes, and he began to walk through it. And, of course, that sparked the refresh and the conversation. In other words, here's a man who's wise enough to have a way to remember, right? And the shortest pencil is longer than the longest memory. And I want you to look at this passage. This is a really powerful passage. Proverbs 22, 17 through 18. Listen, and I will teach you what the wise said. Study their teachings, and you will be glad if you remember them and can quote them. In other words, as you're studying wisdom, you have to find ways to capture it. And there's two primary ways to do this. One would be journaling. As you're studying, take notes. And another way is to memorize it. Most Proverbs are probably 10 to 15 words long. Take you all 2 minutes to memorize one. And when you memorize it, then it will give access to the Spirit of God to illuminate that part of knowledge in your brain when you need it. And find ways to remember and reinforce it. And then lastly, this, now do wisdom. We have to commit to do wisdom. Jesus said these words, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise. Like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rain comes in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse because it was built on bedrock. And the bedrock isn't just knowing it. Did you notice that? What is the bedrock? Doing it. And when we hear a new truth or we hear wisdom, you know what? There's this intellectual buzz that happens with the cognitive recognition of this idea. And it can fool us into thinking we've actually done something with it. But look at what Jesus says next. He says, but anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floods come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. In other words, no matter how much I know of wisdom, if I don't do it, it becomes an act of self-deception. And I just want to ask you to ask yourself, out of these 5 ways to grasp wisdom, to learn wisdom, which one of these has your name on it? And will you do it this week? Is it making or refreshing this commitment? I need to learn wisdom from God every day. I need to open the scriptures and ask the Spirit of God to enlighten me and show me how to apply this to my life. Is it enlisting some friends who will help you stack up wisdom and raise the roof? Is it being more deliberate about listening and asking good questions and accepting correction? Will it be upping the habit of learning how to remember and reinforce truth by journaling and memorization? Or lastly, now do it. There might be a particular thing right now that God's already spoken to you through His Word and by His Spirit about doing it, and you haven't done it yet. Which one of these 5 has your name on it? Because we're going to chase wisdom together. So I want to ask you today, if you would stand to your feet with me, and let me give you this blessing. May you today realize that God Himself wants to give you wisdom and be your teacher. And may you today recognize your own folly and your need. And may you discover the joy and the flourishing that comes from learning wisdom. And all God's people said, amen. Just a reminder, we'll have members from our prayer team up here. They would love to pray with you personally. Go in grace and peace.